It's 7 o'clock on a typical Saturday morning in any Brazilian city. Across thousands of Adventist churches, entire families gather for worship services. Children dress in their finest clothes, elders review final arrangements, deacons organize seating. To outside observers, it appears to be just another day of religious observance. But for those inside, it represents far more. It's an act of spiritual defiance, a prophetic statement, a rehearsal for the ultimate conflict they believe is imminent, the Sunday law. How many times have you heard sermons declaring the Sunday law is at our doorstep? How many mornings have you woken up checking headlines with that familiar knot in your stomach, anticipating the news that would validate everything? How many urgent WhatsApp messages have you received? Critical. New legislation threatens Sabbath. If you were raised Adventist, these aren't theoretical questions. They're woven into your lived religious experience. I've known individuals who turned down outstanding career opportunities because the Sunday law seemed so imminent that compromising didn't seem worthwhile. 15 years later, they're unemployed with deep regrets. Families who liquidated city apartments to purchase remote rural properties because ministers warned survival in urban areas would be impossible once the decree arrived. Their children lost access to quality education, parents lost their livelihoods, and now they're trapped in worse circumstances. Brilliant young people who abandoned medicine, law, and engineering degrees because Adventist professors proclaimed insufficient time remained before Christ's return. Today they work minimum wage jobs, bitter, yet unable to blame the institution. Today we'll investigate with unflinching honesty. Is everything we learned about the Sunday law actually unfolding? Do the facts support our prophetic interpretation? Could Brazil truly be the first nation to enact this legislation? Or have we conflated human interpretation with divine revelation, denominational tradition with biblical truth, psychological anxiety with spiritual discernment? What do Adventists believe regarding the Sunday law? The official position. In the final days, a global mandate will enforce mandatory Sunday observance, persecuting Sabbath keepers. This conviction stems from interpreting Revelation chapter 13 combined with Ellen White's writings, particularly The Great Controversy. But here's the fundamental problem. This interpretation isn't nearly as transparent as we've been led to believe. Try this exercise. Open Revelation 13 and read the entire chapter. How many times does Sunday appear? 0. What about Sabbath? Also 0. The text discusses beasts, horns, marks, and numbers. Nowhere does it explicitly state, the beast's mark represents Sunday observance. This represents an interpretation built upon layers of symbolism, developed during the 19th century by pioneers within a very specific historical context. It might be legitimate, possibly even accurate, but it's certainly not the sole possible interpretation, and definitely not as self-evident as presented to us. Ellen White described the Sunday law as absolute prophetic certainty. In The Great Controversy, published in 1888, she provided detailed scenarios of how the United States would spearhead this movement, how Congress would approve Sunday legislation, how other nations would follow, and how brutal persecution against Sabbath keepers would unfold. But context changes everything. Ellen White wrote during an era when Sunday law debates were extremely prevalent throughout America. Organizations like the National Reform Association actively campaigned to strengthen Sunday legislation. She observed this surrounding her, read about it in newspapers. She took these genuine 19th century trends and projected them forward as inevitable prophetic fulfillment. But did she possess supernatural revelation, or was she extrapolating from her era's trends? And the uncomfortable reality. Numerous specific predictions Ellen White made never materialized. She declared that people alive during her lifetime would witness Christ's return. They didn't. All passed away. She interpreted contemporary events as final signs. They weren't. Does this mean completely rejecting Ellen White? No. She possessed genuine spiritual insights. But we must stop treating her as an infallible prophet. She was human, constrained by 19th century knowledge. Now let's examine the actual history of Sunday laws. Blue laws genuinely existed throughout the United States, Canada, and England. These regulations governed Sunday activities, prohibiting work, commerce, and events. In certain communities you could face fines for Sunday travel, household tasks, even recreational activities. But here's what's crucial. These laws weren't created to persecute Adventists. Most were enacted before the Adventist Church even existed. They were civil statutes with mixed motivations, partially religious, partially secular, concerning labor rights and social order. And what happened to these laws? They were gradually repealed throughout the 20th century. As societies became increasingly pluralistic and secular, Sunday laws were viewed as anachronisms. The U.S. Supreme Court established that government cannot impose religious observance or discriminate against religious minorities. Today, in 2026, what's the actual situation in the United States? There exists no federal law mandating Sunday observance. None whatsoever. There's no significant political movement in this direction. No congressional legislation. You can verify this now on the official congressional website. Search for Sunday law. You'll find nothing substantial. And why not? Because the United States is becoming progressively more secular, not more religious. The percentage of religiously unaffiliated Americans has grown dramatically. Christianity is losing cultural and political influence, not gaining it. The notion that this nation will approve legislation mandating Sunday worship contradicts every trend from the past 5 decades. But Adventists will argue, that's precisely why. It'll come like lightning, unexpectedly. This represents a convenient theological maneuver. When evidence is absent, you reinterpret that absence as part of the prophecy. Impossible to refute, yet also impossible to verify. It's speculation masquerading as certainty. What about Brazil? You've heard the arguments. Brazil is more religious, the evangelical caucus is expanding, we have Christian politicians, so perhaps the decree comes here first. This speculation intensified after the 2018 and 2022 elections, when religious candidates succeeded and the evangelical caucus consolidated congressional presence. Let's examine this with brutal honesty. It's true that 87% of Brazilians identify as Christian, versus 63% of Americans. But census religiosity doesn't translate to support for coercive religious legislation. Research demonstrates that even deeply religious Brazilians value freedom of choice. Most Brazilian Catholics don't practice everything the Church teaches. They selectively choose what to follow. This is the reality. Syncretistic, flexible, individualized Catholicism. The evangelical caucus exists and wields genuine power. But it's not a monolithic bloc. It's a loose coalition of politicians from dozens of denominations who profoundly disagree on many issues. It includes Baptists, Presbyterians, Assembly of God members, Universal Church members, International Grace Church members, and hundreds of other denominations. And crucially, Pentecostals and Neo-Pentecostals, who comprise the vast majority of Brazilian evangelicals and the evangelical caucus, attach no special importance to Sunday. They have no doctrine regarding Sunday sanctity. They hold services Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, every day. For them, Sunday isn't holier than any other day. Why would they support legislation making Sunday mandatory? It makes zero theological sense. The few who value Sunday are historic denominations, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists. But they represent a minority of Brazilian evangelicalism with limited political power. And even among them, imposing Sunday by law isn't a priority. They're concerned with other issues, religious education, church rights, bioethics. What about the 1988 Federal Constitution? Article 5, Section 6, freedom of conscience and belief is inviolable, with free exercise of religious worship guaranteed. Section 8, no one shall be deprived of rights due to religious belief. Any attempt to impose Sunday observance would be flagrantly unconstitutional. It would be struck down by the Supreme Federal Court. It would generate massive protests and institutional crisis. It would be political suicide. Brazil has a strong juridical tradition protecting fundamental rights. The STF has consistently defended religious minority rights, including Adventists. Search for yourself. Check the Chamber of Deputies website, the Senate. Search for bills regarding mandatory Sunday. Nothing exists. There's no organized social movement pressing for this. No church coalition requesting it. The inconvenient truth, there's concrete evidence, absolutely zero, that a Sunday law is approaching in Brazil or the USA. The title's question may rest on a false premise, that the decree will come imminently anywhere. What if it simply doesn't come? What if this prophetic interpretation is mistaken? What if Ellen White, despite all her contributions, was wrong on this specific point? But then why do we keep hearing about this constantly? Here we must be honest about power dynamics within our institution. The Sunday law serves important functions. It keeps members in perpetual vigilance and dependence on the church. It gives artificial urgency to Sabbath observance. It reinforces Adventist identity as a special people. It justifies religious exclusivism. And cynically, it's a control tool. Members living in constant fear are more obedient, more docile, more willing to donate, more institutionally loyal. Concrete examples from the past decade. In 2015, fake news circulated about congressional legislation making Sunday mandatory in Brazil. Total panic. Frantic sharing. When fact-checked, it didn't exist. Complete fabrication. Nobody apologized. In 2019, papal statements about ecology were interpreted as imminent decree. Preachers made videos. Pope announces Sunday law. But the document addressed environmental sustainability, proposing no legislation. During COVID-19, when European countries temporarily restricted Sunday commerce as a public health measure, Adventists shouted, "The decree has begun." They ignored that these were temporary measures, pandemic-related, with no religious connection. The pattern repeats endlessly. Any Sunday mention becomes prophetic fulfillment. It's paranoid interpretation through distorted lenses. The human impact is devastating. The brother who refused excellent career opportunities thinking the decree was near, now unemployed. The family who sold their apartment and bought remote land. Children lost education. Young people who abandoned medicine and law, now in low-wage jobs. Couples who didn't have children, now 50, time has passed. And the generational cost. How many young people left because they grew up hearing about a decree that never came? They say, "I'm tired of alarmism, tired of living in fear, I lost confidence." How many developed clinical anxiety, panic, depression? Therapists report trauma related to fear-based eschatology. Some progressive Adventist theologians attempt to bring balance. They speak about preparation without alarmism, religious freedom without conspiracy, hope instead of fear. But they're marginalized, accused of liberalism, viewed as threats. So what do we do? First, radical intellectual honesty. If there's no evidence, let's state it clearly. Don't invent signs. Don't share fake news. Demand real evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. Second, distinguish essential core faith from potentially mistaken specific interpretations. Our belief in Jesus, his death, resurrection, and return doesn't depend on being correct about every prophetic detail. We can question the decree without abandoning Christian faith. Third, healthy and mature eschatology. That prepares us spiritually without paralyzing us emotionally. That motivates us to live faithfully today, not obsess over speculative timelines. That produces fruits of the Spirit. Peace, joy, patience, not anxiety, fear, paranoia. Fourth, defend genuine and universal religious freedom. Not just for Adventists, but for everyone. Muslims, atheists, Catholics, evangelicals. Real freedom means protecting everyone's conscience. Let's oppose any governmental religious coercion, even when it doesn't directly affect us. Fifth, profound theological humility. Humility to admit when we're wrong. To revise interpretations in light of evidence. To recognize we don't know everything about how God acts. To accept that Ellen White, despite valuable contributions, was human and fallible. To live with uncertainty about future details while maintaining firm faith in essential promises. The title's question reveals more about our cultural anxieties and psychological needs than about objective prophetic reality. It shows how we conveniently adapt our eschatology to our local contexts. It demonstrates our need to feel we're at the center of prophetic action. But the real question isn't when or where the decree will come. It's, are we living as Jesus lived? Loving as Jesus loved? Serving the poor, defending the oppressed, welcoming the marginalized, forgiving enemies, proclaiming good news? These are the real marks of preparation, not obsessive prophetic speculation. In the end, what will matter before God isn't whether we correctly predicted every eschatological event. It's whether we lived with faith, hope, and love. Whether we used our talents to serve. Whether we treated others with dignity and compassion. Whether we pursued truth with honesty. Whether we had courage to question when necessary and humility to change when we were wrong. Perhaps it's time to release the paralyzing anxiety about decrees that may never come in the way we imagine. To stop seeing conspiratorial enemies in every Catholic and Protestant. To admit we don't know everything, and that's okay. To live our faith with joy, authenticity, and love instead of fear, exclusivism, and paranoia. God remains God. Jesus remains Savior. The Spirit continues guiding. Essential biblical promises remain true. That's sufficient. Even if our specific interpretation of the Sunday law is completely wrong, our faith in Christ remains solid. Because in the end, it's He who saves, not our prophetic precision.